The metallic screeching jolted me awake, slicing through the early morning silence like a warning. My heart pounded as I threw off my covers and stumbled toward the front door. It was barely dawn, the sky still a murky shade of gray, but something was happening outside, something that didn't belong. As I flung the door open, the sight before me froze me in place. Two men in matching polo shirts, the unmistakable HOA logo embroidered on their chests, were crouched beside my sister Lisa's wheelchair, a thick, industrial-grade chain wrapped around its frame, the men looping it through the porch railing like they were securing a bicycle to a rack. A heavy padlock clicked shut. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" My voice cracked with disbelief as I rushed forward, barefoot on the cold concrete. The taller man barely glanced at me. Instead, he held out a crisp piece of paper, his expression as blank as the sky above us. Mobility devices must be stored out of sight, per HOA bylaw 23.4. This is your third warning. Third warning? My stomach churned. There was no first or second warning. This was the first time I had even heard of such a rule. Lisa had only been living with me for 3 months. 3 months since the accident that had changed her life forever. After weeks in the hospital, and even more time in grueling physical therapy, she had finally started regaining confidence. Her wheelchair was more than just a device. It was her freedom. And now, these strangers had taken it away. This is medical equipment. I snapped, my voice shaking. You can't just take it up with the board. The second man cut me off, already walking toward a golf cart they had parked at the curb. They were in such a hurry, almost like they knew they were doing something wrong. I dropped to my knees, yanking at the chain, but it was solid steel. The padlock was massive. It would take more than just willpower to break. Behind me, I heard a soft gasp. Lisa stood in the doorway, gripping the wooden frame for support. Her crutches, one she barely used anymore, trembled beneath her hands. Her voice was small. "Sam, what's happening?" I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell her it was a mistake, that I'd fix it in a second. But as I turned to her, seeing the sheer hurt in her eyes, I knew the truth was worse than anything I could make up. This wasn't an accident. This was personal. Lisa's fingers curled into fists, her knuckles turning white. I have an interview today." Her voice cracked. "I can't be late." I scrambled for a solution. "Anything to fix this. We'll get a locksmith. I'll get it cut. We'll make it." But the locksmith wouldn't arrive until the afternoon. And Lisa's interview, her first job opportunity since the accident, was in 2 hours. Panic flashed across her face, but she swallowed it down. Lisa had always been strong. Too strong. "I'll use my crutches," she whispered. I hated that she had to make that choice. She had worked so hard to reclaim her independence, to be able to move freely. And now, because of someone else's prejudice, she was being forced to struggle all over again. By the time I got her into the car and drove her to the interview, I could see it in her posture, the weight of this moment. She wasn't just fighting to walk. She was fighting to be seen, to be treated like a person. While Lisa was in her interview, I drove home, fueled by anger and determination. The first thing I did, I grabbed our HOA rulebook. I wasn't one for confrontation, but this was war. 94 pages of regulations, filled with rules about lawn decorations, fence heights, mailbox colors, but nothing about medical devices, nothing that justified what they had done. I flipped to the bylaw they had referenced, 23.4, and my stomach twisted. It mentioned mobility devices. Sure, but it was lumped in with bikes and scooters. I gritted my teeth. A wheelchair wasn't a bike. It wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. And yet, in this neighborhood, my neighborhood, it was being treated as an eyesore. Outside, my neighbor Diane Peterson walked past, casually watering her garden gnomes, which were against HOA rules. "Diane," I called out, "can I ask you something?" She looked around before stepping closer. "If this is about Barbara," she whispered, "I'd be careful. Barbara Thompson, HOA president." Diane leaned in. "She doesn't like change." Change. That's what she called it. Not discrimination. Not cruelty. Just change. And in Barbara's world, Lisa wasn't just a person. She was a problem to be removed, That night, I emailed the HOA board. I cited federal disability laws. I provided proof that Lisa's wheelchair was a medical device. Their response came within an hour. Your request for exemption is denied. Additionally, the unauthorized wheelchair ramp at your front entrance must be removed within 48 hours. My heart stopped. The ramp, the one I had permits for, the one the city had approved, this wasn't about rules anymore. This was a message. And Barbara Thompson was making it very clear. We weren't welcome here. I took a deep breath and did what I should have done from the start. I documented everything. Photos, emails, records of selective enforcement, where certain homeowners were allowed to break rules while others were punished. I compiled it all into a folder of truth. And the next night, I took that truth straight to the HOA meeting. The moment I stepped inside the community center, conversation stopped. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me. At the front of the room, Barbara sat like a queen on a throne, flanked by her 4 loyal board members. I raised my hand. Barbara's lips curled into a smirk. She ignored me, skipped past me, again and again. Finally, I stood. I'd like to address the board about disability accommodations and the illegal chaining of medical equipment. The room fell into a thick, suffocating silence. Barbara's eyes narrowed. That's not on tonight's agenda, she snapped. Sit down. A voice cut through the silence. I want to hear what she has to say. Kevin Jackson, a neighbor I barely knew. My mother uses a wheelchair too, he said. And just like that, the room shifted. Barbara wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was fighting all of us. And she didn't even realize it yet. After publicly challenging Barbara at the HOA meeting, the protagonist realizes that the battle is far from over. The next morning, she finds yellow eviction notices plastered across her front door. But they aren't real. They're fake HOA documents, meant to scare her into silence. That same day, a surveillance camera appears, aimed directly at her front door. The message is clear. She's being watched. But instead of backing down, she vows to fight harder. Just when she starts feeling isolated, her neighbor Kevin Jackson knocks on her door at night, his face tense, his voice low. But what he reveals shakes her to her core. He's an undercover FBI agent. The corruption within the HOA runs deeper than anyone imagined. Years of fraud, discrimination, and stolen homeowner funds. And now, Barbara's actions against Lisa have caught the FBI's attention in a whole new way. The protagonist is faced with an impossible choice: walk away and stay safe, or fight back and risk everything. Kevin warns her. Barbara has powerful connections, including friends in the local police department. If she exposes the truth, retaliation will be swift. But when she hears Lisa struggling to move on her own, too proud to ask for help, too exhausted to fight anymore, she knows there's only one real option: stand up no matter the cost. As she works with Kevin, they uncover secret payments, fraudulent fines, and evidence that Barbara has rigged every HOA election for years. But the most shocking discovery? Barbara isn't working alone. Several board members are involved, and some neighbors are spying for her. The fight isn't just about Lisa's wheelchair anymore. It's about unmasking an entire system built on greed and intimidation. Just as the protagonist and Kevin prepare to expose everything, a brick crashes through Lisa's bedroom window. Attached is a chilling note: leave or worse. The police arrive, but their report is full of deliberate errors, a sign that Barbara's influence runs deeper than expected. But instead of scaring her away, this attack only fuels her determination. She turns to Kevin with a single question: what do we do next? The sound of breaking glass cut through the silence like a gunshot. Lisa let out a startled gasp from the other room. I bolted down the hallway, my heart pounding. When I reached Lisa's bedroom, I saw it. A brick lay on the carpet, surrounded by a mess of shattered glass. A note was taped to it, its message written in jagged, angry letters: leave or worse. Lisa gripped the arms of her wheelchair, her breath unsteady. Sam! Her voice was barely a whisper. I swallowed my fear and marched outside, my hands shaking with rage. The street was empty. Whoever had done this was already gone, but I knew who was behind it. I called the police. expecting help. Instead, I got indifference. The officer who arrived, a man in his 50s with tired eyes, barely looked at the note before scribbling on his notepad. Could be kids messing around, he muttered. Not much we can do without proof. Proof? I gestured at the broken window, the threatening note, the brick still lying on the floor. This isn't a prank. This is harassment. He gave a shrug that sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't here to help. He was here to dismiss me. And that's when I knew Barbara had friends in law enforcement, just like Kevin warned me. When the officer left without promising any real action, I turned to Kevin, who had arrived just in time to witness the whole exchange. This isn't working, I admitted, my voice shaking. She's too powerful. Kevin's expression hardened. That's what she wants you to think. He picked up the brick and the note, slipping them into an evidence bag. She just made a mistake, he said. This is criminal intimidation. And now we have proof. I took a deep breath and nodded. Barbara had just sealed her fate. That night, Barbara called an emergency HOA meeting. The timing was too perfect. She was scared. She knew we were close to exposing everything. Kevin and I arrived at the packed clubhouse, my folder of evidence clutched in my hands. Dozens of neighbors filled the room. People who had once stayed silent, now eager for answers. Barbara sat at the head of the table, flanked by her loyal board members. Her expression was calm, but her eyes darted around the room. She was on edge. She picked up her gavel. This meeting is about new security measures for... No, I cut in, stepping forward. This meeting is about the illegal chaining of my sister's wheelchair and the harassment you've directed at my family. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Barbara's expression froze. Your personal complaints aren't on tonight's agenda, she said coldly. I pulled out the chain, the same one that had been wrapped around Lisa's wheelchair. It clanked loudly against the table. This isn't complaint, I said. This is a crime. A murmur spread through the room. Barbara's mask slipped for a second, her lips pressing into a thin line. The HOA has a right to enforce. Not like this. I lifted a stack of documents and photos. I have proof that you selectively enforce rules to punish people you don't like. I have emails where you call disabled residents an eyesore. I have bank statements showing that HOA funds were used for things that had nothing to do with our community, like your luxury SUV. The room exploded with whispers. Barbara's face turned a dangerous shade of red. You have no right to accuse me of... A voice cut through the noise. I want to see those documents. Jack Wilson, a longtime board member, stood up. I handed him the folder. As he flipped through it, his face darkened. This, he muttered, shaking his head. This is fraud. Barbara's control was slipping. I could see it in her clenched jaw, in the way her hands trembled slightly. And then Kevin stood. The entire room turned to him. I'd like to introduce myself, he said, pulling something from his jacket. An FBI badge. Barbara went pale. This community has been under investigation for months, Kevin continued. We have evidence of financial fraud, selective enforcement, and civil rights violations. And thanks to Samantha, we now have direct proof of criminal harassment. Barbara shot to her feet. This is ridiculous. This is... The doors opened. Several FBI agents walked in. One of them held up the chain they had retrieved from Barbara's garage, the same one from Lisa's wheelchair. The lead agent turned to Barbara. Barbara Thompson, we have a warrant for your arrest. Silence. For the first time since this all started, Barbara had nothing to say. As the agents placed her in handcuffs, a neighbor shouted, "What about the missing HOA money?" One of the FBI agents held up a thick folder of financial records. It's all here. Over $350,000 in stolen homeowner funds. Barbara was escorted out, her once perfect hair now disheveled, her face tight with anger. The neighborhood she once controlled watched in stunned silence. Then someone clapped. And another, until the whole room was cheering. Justice had finally arrived. Over the next few days, everything changed. Barbara and 2 board members were officially charged with fraud, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. Their bank accounts were frozen, their positions stripped. An emergency HOA election was held, and for the first time in years, the community had a voice. I was shocked when they asked me to join the new board. "We need someone who actually cares," Mrs. Foster said. "Someone who stands up for what's right." I hesitated, then looked at Lisa, who nodded. Maybe this was how real change began. The first thing we did, we rewrote the HOA rules. No more selective enforcement. No more hidden fees. No more bullying. Lisa became a consultant for community accessibility, ensuring no one else with a disability was ever mistreated again. And the infamous chain, we hung it in the community center, with a small plaque beneath it: "Freedom requires courage, community, and sometimes the FBI." 2 months later, our neighborhood held its first ever block party. Children played freely, without fear of HOA violations. Neighbors, many who had once felt isolated, finally talked, laughed, and shared food. Lisa wheeled onto the new accessible pathways, racing the neighborhood kids on their bikes. And for the first time in months, she smiled. As we sat together that evening, Lisa squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" I asked. "For not giving up." She looked out at the community, now filled with hope instead of fear. Then she smiled. "The best revenge isn't getting even." She turned to me, her eyes filled with strength and peace. "It's getting better."